amigues, welcome to another video. My name is Pam and I like to talk about books, and today I wanted to talk to you about all the books that I've read recently. I've pretty consistently this year, or at least for like the past half a year probably, I've been doing some tidy monthly recaps at the start of each month. I talk about the books that I read in the previous month, but this one's going to be a little less tidy because I talked about some books that I was reading in my last reading vlog, and then I didn't have time to do a monthly recap before going on a trip at the beginning of October. So it doesn't really matter. I'm just going to talk about the books that I've read recently. It doesn't make a difference to you whether I read them specifically in one month or not, but I just wanted to, for my own sake, talk about how that recap timeline is shifting a little bit for this one. But either way, I have a bunch of books to talk about that I've read and for the most part had a really good time with in the past month. I feel like I've read a lot less in the past couple weeks just because I've been a little more busy than usual. So I was thinking like maybe this will be a short one, but you know how that goes when I promise that I'm gonna keep it short and sweet and then it ends up being an hour-long video anyways. And I made a list of the books that I read in the past few weeks that I need to talk about, and it's still quite a good number of books. So yeah, I think we'll have plenty to yap about this video anyways. And yeah, let's just get on with it. I will start off first with my only nonfiction of the past few weeks. Last month, well, the last half of September and then the first half of October was Latino Heritage Month. So I was making like halfway of a concerted effort to read books by and about Latinos. And I say like halfway of an effort because I feel like that's the stories that I prioritize and I'm drawn to regularly anyways. So I just kind of read them throughout the entirety of the year usually. But I was like, let me put these a little further up the list for at least this month. So the nonfiction that I read recently is called Our Migrant Souls by Hector Tovar, and it's actually called Our Migrant Souls, a meditation on race and the meanings and myths of Latino, in quotes. So this is a nonfiction that's like part essays and part memoir, I would say. Hector Tovar is a Latino author, and I'm not too familiar with him, but I think he's pretty well known as like a Latino scholar. He is a professor at UC Irvine. I think he's written other books, both fiction and nonfiction. And so he grew up in California as a son of Latino immigrants, and he's in his middle age now, so he's kind of lived through a lot of like important moments and movements in the Chicano and Latino communities, and he talks a lot about that and his childhood growing up in a racially diverse city and neighborhood. And some parts of the book are written as Tovar speaking to his students who oftentimes look and have similar backgrounds as him. So they're also Latinos or mixed race or Black students. So he's talking to them about like what it means to be Latino, and also interweaving like some of their stories. He's like, these are some of the stories I've heard from my students over the years. So it's just kind of a little bit stream of consciousness, a little bit weaving in and out of stories and reflections. I enjoyed this book for the most part. I think my key takeaway was just like a deeper understanding of the fact that Latinidad and like the term Latino, the shifting of that, Hispanic, all the different labels that like society and the government and ourselves, we put on what we are based on where our ancestors come from, like how much of that really is a societal construct. And I think more and more nowadays, I'm just feeling more like liberated by this than feeling a sense of like lack of identity, which is something that I have kind of struggled in and out with for my whole life. But I think more nowadays, I'm just feeling very free by the fact that really us as quote unquote Latinos, we can really define what that means to us. And we're the ones that really give it that definition and depth by embracing our culture, honoring our ancestors, their stories and struggles. So this book was just a really good reminder of that. And I liked how the Wad also talked a lot about Indigenous struggles, Black liberation, and how all of those are mixed into what Latino means specifically in America. So that concept of intersectionality and how you can't really fight for like your people as Latinos without also taking into account Black struggles and Indigenous struggles. And just acknowledging that like what really unites all of us as minorities in America is a shared past of oppression and violence and empire. I listened to this as an audiobook, and I was admittedly maybe a little distracted while listening to some of this because I started this on the plane to Europe. I went on a week-long Europe trip recently, and I was listening to a large portion of this, like the majority of this, during that trip. So I was maybe at times a little bit distracted. I did find myself having to like rewind and listen to things more than once. So I think because my one complaint or like the one downside to this nonfiction book that I found is that it was a little meandering and maybe not super organized in a way that was very defined and structured, but that feeling might have been heightened by the fact that I was a little distracted while listening to this, admittedly. But yeah, like I said, overall, I enjoyed this. I thought the Wad made a lot of really strong points and statements, and I recommend this to anybody who's interested in exploring the topic of Latinidad in America. I think it's just one more of the many great books by Latin Americans in the United States at this point. So yeah, another great one to add to that literary canon. Another audiobook that similarly I also listened to during my trip, and that was also a collection of essays. I chose these two books as my travel audiobooks because I was like, one, they're both by Latin American authors. It was Latino Heritage Month, so I was basing it partly off of that, but also because they were short stories or essays. So I thought if I'm going to be like a little bit distracted, if I'm going to be listening to these a little bit in fragments as I have time, I'd rather do like short stories or essays. So they're like snippets and I don't have to keep track of a larger plot while my mind is a little all over the place. So I don't know how well executed that ended up being, because I still feel like I was distracted a lot while listening to these. So, just keep that in mind for these reviews. But the other audiobook that I listened to was The Dangers of Smoking in Bed by Mariana Enriquez, who is a Latin American author. She's from Argentina, and she's mostly known for her short horror stories. Previously, I had read another short story collection of hers, which I think was the first one, and that was The Things We Lost in the Fire. And I read that one either earlier this year or last year. I think it might have been last year. And I enjoyed it. I read it in a physical version and I read it in Spanish. But yeah, I had a good time with that one. Can't say I remember a lot about each of the individual stories, but I have like a vague sense of some of them and the themes and topics that she touched on them. She weaves like Argentinian geopolitical and social issues into her horror stories, which I enjoyed in that first collection. This one, similarly, all horror stories. I read this one in English, or I listened to this one, I should say, in English. So there's like that added layer of translation in there. But like the first one, her stories are very graphic and bleak, and there's not a lot of levity in them. Yeah, I don't know. Overall, I thought this short story collection was fine. I feel like the previous one that I read, her first short story collection, was just stronger for me. And in general, I'm just not a huge short story collection enjoyer. So really that's just like on me, because I know that this is not my favorite format, and yet I keep trying to enjoy short story collections because I just hear like good things about them and I'm like, I want to read, and then it always ends up falling short because I feel like it's hard to keep me engaged when we can't really like fully develop characters. I love like a long, indulgent character development, vibes heavy type of book, and short story collections are kind of the opposite of that. They're like quick bursts where, I don't know, for me, I struggled with like finding the point for a lot of these besides just like telling a very crude, gruesome story. And maybe I was just also like lacking some of like the social political context from Argentina. But yeah, I thought it was a little underwhelming. None of the stories really stood out to me, and I don't think they'll, like, I'm already struggling to recall most of them at this point. I feel like I can recall stories from the collection that I read like more than a year ago better than I can for this one that I just read a few weeks ago. Like I said, I was also a little distracted listening to this audiobook, but yeah, I thought it was fine. Didn't love it, didn't hate it, but just fell somewhere down the middle. Not gonna be a memorable one for me, I don't think. And she has other short story collections that are highly praised, and I hear about a lot from people that I trust and have similar tastes to. But based on my 2 experiences with Enriquez so far, I don't know. I think I'm gonna give it some time and space and then maybe circle back around to her other stories, but we'll see. Something that was funny to me about this audiobook was that it was narrated by the same voice actress as the Caraval books, which I have read the trilogy or listened to the trilogy in the past year. So her voice is very familiar to me and kind of now forever associated in my mind with Caraval and those characters. And those books, I've talked about them at length, just how unserious they are. And they're just very, very different vibes from this short story collection, which was just gruesome and horror and a lot more serious than the Caraval books. But it just was tickling me to hear her voice in this context. I just kept expecting her to like break out into like, Scarlet, you're the love of my life. Or just like, legend, how dare you lie to me? Those great lines from the Caraval series. Rebecca Soleil, I think is her name. She's a great voice actress. That was just me. She has a very recognizable voice to me, which I thought was funny in this context. Okay, another audiobook from the past few weeks. Actually, most of these are going to be audiobooks because I just have had a lot less like physical reading, no distraction time recently. So audiobook listens have been up, physical reading has been down. There will be a couple, but another audiobook that I listened to, and this one I actually listened to before the trip, so we're going a little bit back in time, see if I can remember stuff. But that was Lightning in Her Hands by Raquel Vasquez Gilliland. This book is a second book in a romance book series. So typically for romance, when they're in a series, they're kind of standalone, kind of sequels, in the sense that you could read them individually without knowing much about the ones that come before, but you'll just miss some of the context. The first one in the series is Witch of Wild Things, which I read a few years ago and really, really loved. It's a cozy, witchy romance series with some fantasy elements. So in that first one, which follows a witch called Sage, we are introduced to her and her sisters, Teal and Sky. So yeah, you don't need to know much about what happens in the first one other than the context of them being sisters and all having individual powers. So this second one is the middle sister story, Teal. She is dealing with a lot of recent changes in her life. She, not too long ago, had a bad breakup with a boyfriend, and then that led to her getting in another relationship, which was an abusive one, and then she got out of that relationship. So now she just finds herself in a moment of a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and with a lot of healing to do. She also has a complicated relationship with her sisters and her mother, who abandoned them basically when they were children. They were mostly raised by their great aunt and their grandmother, and all of those relationships are pretty complicated. And then on top of that, she gets invited to her ex's wedding, and she, just to show him like that she's doing well, she wants to go. So she invites her ex, like, situationship, childhood crush for many years to be her plus one, and that results in, you know, more complicated relationship stuff, because in order to agree to be her plus one, he proposes that they fake being in a relationship because, you know, he's got his own stuff going on where he needs to be married by a certain point to claim his inheritance. Listen, the details of all of this are a little fuzzy in my mind at this point because, first of all, like, fake relationships, fake marriages, one of my least favorite tropes in a romance novel. Recently, I read one that I really didn't like with that trope. This one did have that trope, but it was done in a way that I enjoyed more than the previous one that I read recently. I think Raquel Vasquez Gillian, she does a really good job of blending the romance with like the sister dynamics and also like a lot of very serious and darker topics that I think could, if not done properly, kind of really darken the mood of this type of novel. But overall, I feel like she does it in a way where it feels like still very careful and not insensitive at all, but it still manages to overall be lighthearted and positive, which I appreciate. So she talks about Teal's trauma with like her physically and emotionally abusive ex-boyfriend and how she's healing from that and learning from that in a very sensitive way. And then she also talks about Teal's bipolar diagnosis and how she deals with that. So yeah, I think that's like my favorite part of these novels, along with just like the cozy, witchy vibes of them. That's something that I really enjoy. I love a cozy fantasy story, but one that's not like no plot, no stakes, just vibes. I feel like these have enough plot and character development and stakes to keep me interested. And there's like the added element of the romance, which was fine in this book. It wasn't my favorite part by any means, but I enjoyed it for the most part. I think the part that I found the most frustrating, or the part that I liked the least, was just like how comically villainous some of the characters in this were. Like, Carter's grandmother was just like cartoon villain, evil and nefarious, and I thought it was a little over the top. Just like all the grandmas in this world are just so evil, and that's so far from my experience with grandmas. My grandmas are the sweetest, most caring people in the world, so I could not relate. But yeah, that, and then also it was really hard sometimes to read just like how much Teal would like bully herself and how hard she was on herself. And I guess understanding her story and her all the things that she had been through, her trauma and everything, it does make sense. It does feel realistic, but it was just sometimes really hard to sit with, like, so much negative self-talk. I think Teal could really use a lot of therapy, a lot of support, and we do see her get some of that throughout the story, so that was good. So yeah, I enjoyed this. It was still overall like lighthearted and feel good. And it was a really good novel to transition from like the summer to the fall, because it had enough of like those cozy spooky season vibes, and it had like the elements of like witches and their powers, so I enjoyed that. One thing I was not so much enjoying at the time was the fact that Teal is a big runner. I had just gotten really hurt trying to go for a run, and I was recovering from an injury. But then it happens in the book as well. She goes on a run, she overdoes it, and then she gets a really bad injury. And I was like, oh my god, wait, this is crazy that I'm reading this right now. I don't think like, when was the last time I read a book about a runner and then they get an injury and I'm going through that at the same time? Books have a crazy way of finding you exactly at the right moment, and not that this was like life-changing or anything, but it was just kind of a crazy coincidence. But yeah, I think me and Teal are both on the come up, and I'm happy for us for that. So yeah, this was Lightning in Her Hands, and I really enjoyed it. It was a good witchy romance. A lot like another one of the audiobooks that I listened to, A Witch's Guide to Magical Inkeeping by Sangu Mandana. So this is also a book too. Well, I say that. No, this is the second book I read by this author. And the first book that I read by her was very similar in that it was like a cozy romance novel that featured a witch. So this is seemingly like in that same world, but that first book was not referenced at all. So it's not a series. They're standalones completely, but very similar vibes. So in this one, we are following a witch named Sarah who lives in the English countryside. She is a very powerful witch, and in England they have a guild of witches, and they are kind of like the ruling authority on witchcraft in the country. And they also kind of take charge of like identifying young wizards and witches, people with magical powers at an early age, and then they bring them to the guild to start training them and making sure that they adhere to like their rules for magic and things like that. So Sarah goes to the guild when she's young and starting to discover her powers, and the guild realizes that she's very powerful. She might even be like one of the most powerful witches in the country when she reaches like her full potential. And there's specifically the guild leader, who right now is known as like the most powerful wizard in the country, and he sees Sarah's potential and kind of takes her under his wing. But Sarah also notices that he is sometimes like a little bit of a questionable mentor. He's sometimes like down on her, and he's like, I don't know about all your powers, like you might not ever get to be to my level, but that's okay. He like doesn't want her to reach her full potential, perhaps because he's scared that she might overtake him as the most powerful wizard. But anyway, she is like developing her skills in the guild. She also has some family in the countryside, and she is being raised mostly by her great aunt Jasmine, because her parents are kind of in the picture, but not really. They mostly left it up to Jasmine to raise and protect their daughter. And one day, Sarah finds her great aunt Jasmine dead in the garden, and she freaks out and she learns of a resurrection spell. So without kind of hesitation at all, she tries this spell on her great aunt, and it brings her back to life. But the spell was so big and intense and powerful that it like fully used up all of Sarah's powers, seemingly for good. So Sarah is left with like a very, very, very reduced version of her powers. Like she basically has no more powers left. And so she's kicked out of the guild, and she goes back home with her aunt Jasmine and basically has to help her with running her business, which is a magical a magical bed and breakfast. The remainder of Sarah's powers, basically all she can use them for is to keep this bed and breakfast running. It's got like certain magical elements that she helps her Aunt Jasmine with. Now it's been a few years since this happened and she lost her powers, and they're just going through life running the bed and breakfast. Sarah is still kind of dealing with the fallout of like being potentially the most powerful witch to losing all her powers, and she has struggled with that. It's caused her to have mental health issues. She's often been in depressive periods, and she has thought about what it would take to potentially bring her powers back, but she knows that it could be very risky and dangerous, and she's also not allowed to go back to the guild. So a lot of like the spell books that she would need to use and reference in order to try to gain her powers back are all housed at the guild, which she's not welcome at anymore. But it's something that's been at the back of her mind for a long time. And then on the other side, we also have Luke, who is a historian who works at the guild, coincidentally. He is at the guild primarily because his younger sister, Posey, is a witch and she's autistic, so she's had a lot of trouble with like schooling. And so Luke takes her to the guild because they're the most renowned institute of academics for witches. So he's like, if anyone will be able to help me with her schooling, it's going to be the guild. So he goes to the guild, but they are not really equipped to be able to teach somebody who's a witch and neurodivergent like Posey. He is not satisfied with the education and treatment that she's getting there. So he leaves the guild. And the thing about the bed and breakfast that Sarah and her aunt run is that it has an enchantment on it where not anybody can just show up to this bed and breakfast. It specifically makes itself known and leads people who, one, are like pure of heart. No assholes can enter this bed and breakfast, but it leads people who are lost and in need of shelter. So it's like if you're wandering the road one day and get turned around and need accommodations for the night one day, you'll suddenly be led to the bed and breakfast. So that is what happens to Luke. He ends up at Batty Hall at Sarah's door, and they actually know each other from their childhood at the guild. They weren't friends before, but they're acquaintances. And so he stays there for the night, isn't planning on staying there for long. And then things go from there. It is a romance above all, so you can use your imagination there. I liked this. I didn't like it as much as the first of Mandana's books, which was Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I think that's what it was called. And I really enjoyed that one. It was one of my first like cozy romances. So maybe it's just because I've read a few more at this point and have more points of reference. But yeah, I enjoyed this, but I wasn't like blown away by it. I wasn't over the moon with it. The romance aspect of it, I felt was like the weakest part of the story. I just wasn't really feeling the spark between Sarah and Luke. It felt a little forced to me. But besides that, I really enjoyed the other aspects of the book. I really, really loved Posey's character and talking about her neurodivergence and just how ill-equipped a lot of society is to just be able to help and just make life normal and easy for someone with autism like Posey. I also enjoyed the exploration of Sarah's like mental health struggles and her depression. And there were also moments when Sarah, as a South Asian person in England, talks about the way that she's treated and sometimes seen as an outsider in her own country where she was born because of like the color of her skin or her background. So yeah, there was like some moments of exploration of like deeper themes and topics that I really appreciated the way that Sangha Mandana was able to incorporate them into the narrative without feeling like shoehorned in or anything. Yeah, like lightning in her hands. This was a very cozy, feel-good time, but it didn't feel like there was absolutely no stakes. Also had a lot of character development, which I enjoyed. It just didn't quite live up to my love for Secret Society of Irregular Witches, but it was still a very cute and wholesome novel that I recommend if you're in the mood for something fall and witchy and cozy. A Witch's Guide to Magical Inkeeping. Okay, and while we're still on the topic of witches, my next read, and this was a physical book, was The Bewitching by Silvia Moreno Garcia. One of my most highly anticipated books of this year, and it did not disappoint. Spoiler. Silvia Moreno Garcia just consistently delivers, but this one, to me, was on another level. I've read a lot of Silvia Moreno Garcia now over the years. This year alone, I think this is my third book, and I still have some books to get to in her catalog. She is prolific. Silvia Moreno Garcia, why do you write like you're running out of time? But keep doing it. My first book of hers was Mexican Gothic. I think like many people, that's her most famous one. That's what got me into Silvia Moreno Garcia. That's how I became aware of her. And I've liked all her books that I've read since then, but like none of them have lived up to that feeling of like mysticism and awe that I felt when I first read Mexican Gothic. Like I had just never read anything like that before. The blend of genres and then incorporating like Mexican history and Mexican culture and lore was just really cool, and I had never read a book like that before. But now The Bewitching, I felt a lot of similar feelings. It's very different from Mexican Gothic, but the things that I felt while reading this reminded me of reading Mexican Gothic for the first time. So in this story, we follow 3 different generations of women. There's a protagonist and a timeline that we're following in the 90s. Her name is Minerva. She is a Mexican college student in Boston, and she is doing her graduate thesis on this author that she really loves, Beatrice Tremblay, who is now a very famous horror author, and Minerva is looking into her life because one of her stories, The Vanishing, is said to be inspired by something that Beatrice experienced in real life, where one of her female friends went missing. So Minerva is doing some research, seeing what information she can uncover, what new facts and findings she can unearth about Beatrice and this mysterious disappearing. And then weird, creepy things start happening to her, and Minerva is really reminded of the tales that her grandmother would tell her when she was younger. Her grandmother was a big believer in things occult, and she was very superstitious. She believed in the supernatural. She would always tell Minerva, when I was younger, witches still existed. So the things that are happening and the things that Minerva is learning in present day, or in the 90s timeline that we're in, are really bringing to mind and making her think of the stories that her grandmother would tell her, or her great-grandmother. Yes, I think it's her great-grandmother, that she would tell her when she was younger. So the other timeline that we follow is that of Minerva's great-grandmother, Alba, and this is in the early 1900s in Mexico. Alba lives on a ranch in Mexico with her mother and her brother, and her father has recently passed away, so he was the man of the house. He ran the ranch, ran their business, and Alba's brother is younger than she is. He is compelled to step up to now be like the man of the house, take care of his father's asuntos, but he's very young. So Alba's mother's brother comes in. He is a sophisticated man who lives in the city. He comes in from the DF and he's like, let me help y'all out. You need somebody to step in here and help you get all your business together. And Alba absolutely loves him, maybe a little too much. And he similarly feels a certain way about her. So she's very, taken by him. She's a little bit blinded by this very interesting love that she has for her uncle. So she is maybe not quite ready to see some of the red flags that start very quickly appearing when he makes his way into their lives. And in that timeline, similarly to Minerva's timeline, some very strange, macabre things begin happening, and Alba is trying to figure out why that is, what's causing them. And then our third and final timeline is Beatrice Tremblay. So this is the author that Minerva is researching. Her story takes place in the 30s, and she's a college student at the same college that Minerva is now studying, and she has a couple of roommates. One of them is very into like dark and spooky things. She believes in like spirits and supernatural things. She hosts seances, and Beatrice is very taken by her. She's starting to fall for her. Of course, she doesn't like outright tell her feelings. This is the 30s, so they have a very strong friendship, and Beatrice starts to develop these feelings for her. And then one day, as we know, she goes mysteriously missing. She vanishes. So through this timeline, we're kind of seeing all the events that occurred leading up to her disappearance, and Minerva is also learning of these things in her timeline, trying to put the pieces together. And then these stories kind of like interweave, and a lot of the elements come into play into each other's stories. So yes, like I said, really, really love this book. I think it's up there with Mexican Gothic now as one of my favorite Silvia Moreno Garcia books, and I think it's because it's just like straight up a horror mystery novel, and the way that Silvia Moreno Garcia writes horror is just really fun. Since I finished reading this, I have seen a lot of the criticism of this book is that it was like too obvious from very early on, like who the villains of the story were, and I can't say that I disagree. Like, there wasn't a lot of like surprise when the villains were revealed, but I don't know, that didn't really bother me. I didn't think that was the point of the story. I think we're meant to be kind of like the omnipresent view. We get like a bird's eye view of everything that's happening, and there is like some mystery, but like I think we are meant as readers to know more than the protagonists themselves and to like ahead of everything, like piece it all together. So I don't think that was necessarily a bad thing for me. I still found it very intriguing and still found it very fun and interesting, even though I knew who at least one of the villains was. I really like, and I've talked about this with other SMG novels before, the way that she writes her protagonists is really cool. They're all very individually and well developed. I will say that Minerva felt a little more underdeveloped than characters of hers have felt before to me. I found Beatrice and Alba as protagonists a lot more interesting and with a lot more depth than Minerva did. Minerva felt a little more like a self-insert, both for Silvia and I think for us as readers. But I really like, as always, how she incorporates elements of Mexican culture and folklore, and in this book it was specifically like lore about witches in Mexican folklore, which are pretty different to like Western and Northern American witches. So she talks both about that because this book takes place in Boston, so there is a lot of like the traditional witches that we think about in the United States, like Salem witch trials, burning witches at the stake, the you know, the typical picture we have of witches, but then it's also incorporated with the more Mexican view of the supernatural and of witches specifically. So I thought that was really cool. The other like kind of tricky part to talk about in this book is the relationship between Alba and her uncle. I mean, there's no way around it. I won't beat around the bush. It's taboo, it's incestuous, and it was really uncomfortable to read about. But I didn't find it I'm like, I was okay with the incest. I feel like it added to the sense of like unease and like just uncomfortable feelings that we were already experiencing as part of this story. So I think if it wasn't there, I would be okay with it. I wouldn't be like, you know what this story's missing? A little bit of incest. Yeah, I wouldn't have missed it, but at the same time, like, you know, Silvia Garcia is somebody who really does her research and she knows her stuff. She knows about classic horror and she knows that that's a part of a lot of these classic horror stories, for better or for worse. So I think it was like a nod to that. And I don't know what else to say about that. I just think you should know that there is an element of that going into this because, yeah, it caught me off my guard. I'll say that. But I won't like knock down my rating for this, or like it didn't lessen my enjoyment of the story, if that makes sense. So yeah, really, really love this one. Another one in the bag for Miss Moreno Garcia, one of my favorites. And now one of my top 2 books of hers. I don't know. I think it's still sitting slightly under Mexican Gothic, but that's only because I had never read anything like Mexican Gothic when I read that one years ago now. So it's just kind of like the feeling that I'll never get again. So I don't think anything can beat that, honestly, but we'll see. She might surprise me and pull something out of her head for next year's novel, but I'll be anxiously awaiting whatever read of hers comes next for me. Okay, next, another book that is perfect for spooky season and actually has a lot of similar elements to The Bewitching because we follow 3 different women through 3 different timelines throughout history, is Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil by V. Schwab. This book was so good. I loved it. Again, not my first rodeo in a V. Schwab book. I have read The Villains duology, Vicious, and the second book. And loved those. Those were amazing, especially Vicious. Vicious, top tier, 5 out of 5. And then I've also read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I really, really loved as well. Those 2 are very different, like vibes-wise to each other, but they both have like that signature V. Schwab flair and her impeccable writing style. And this one, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, was like a perfect combination of Vicious and Addie LaRue. It was like their little love child with a little sapphic vampire flair. So, like I said, we follow 3 different timelines with 3 different women. The first one we meet is Alice, and that's the present day one. We meet her in 2019. She's a Scottish college student, and she's also a student in Boston. So another similarity. We're kind of thrown into her life immediately. We see that she's a little bit lost in life. She's struggling with her self-confidence and with her identity and like figuring out who she wants to be in life. She's a little bit lost and wandering. And one night she goes to a party And, you know, she's trying to build herself up, trying to let loose, have fun. And she meets this woman who she thinks is beautiful. She's like instantly enraptured by her. And she kind of embodies like all the things that she is striving to be. So she's very like taken by her. They go home, they have a lovely night together. But then in the morning she wakes up and she's not feeling so well. She realizes eventually that like things are gonna change. Her life has taken a turn and now she has to kind of piece it back together, try to understand what's happening and how to move forward from there. Our other protagonist is Maria. We meet her in the 1500s in Spain. She is a free spirit. She has a lot of ambition and a lot of grit, and she feels very limited by the options that are available to her in life as a woman in the 1500s, understandably. I can only imagine how constraining that must feel. And so she decides to take matters into her own hands as much as she can. And then eventually we also meet Charlotte in the 1800s. So similarly, she's a woman who has a lot of desires for her life that she feels are not able to come true because of what society expects of her. She wants to be able to just love who she loves unabashedly and not have to marry a man. And unfortunately, that's not what the options allow her in this point in time in society. So she also finds or looks for freedom in some dark places. And eventually these three narratives come together. And this is a long book. It's very detailed, very descriptive. I feel like that would be a negative for some people if you like faster paced, like plot heavy novels. Like this one is more character heavy. It's more drawn out and indulgent, and I really love V. Schwab's writing style. I love the things she has to say, so I didn't mind it being so drawn out and long. I was quite enjoying my time with each of these women's stories. I liked V. Schwab's portrayal of queerness with each of these women and how their desires were stymied by society's expectations of them throughout history, like even up until the modern timeline, the modern era, in different ways. You know, that patriarchal society morphs and changes, but it's ever present. A common motif in this story, or like something that comes up again and again, is the topic of hunger, because obviously we're talking about vampires, and the way that V. Schwab portrays them is very haunting, and I thought was really cool, but also really scary, and you can really feel like the weight that would put on you, because she describes it as like this hunger that's ever present. After you feed, you feel good in that moment, but then a second later you're already like starving again, and it's just like this insatiable hunger. And besides like the literal feeling of that, I think we can also interpret it as like these women's desire and hunger for like something more, and like they're always trying to chase it and never feeling satisfied by their options or by the lack of constraints that they feel. Yeah, I think the questions posed in this are like, what makes you human? What is at the core of ourselves? Like, without mortality, do we still have a soul? What makes us good? And can we save ourselves from our worst instincts with good intentions? And I think, I don't know, I just kept being surprised by like what some of the answers to those questions were as the story developed in V. Schwab's eyes. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. V. Schwab does a really good job of writing morally gray characters, and I love a morally gray character. And this book was full of them. So yeah, I don't typically go for vampire books, but I loved V. Schwab's take on it. This was a very haunting and delicious book. Okay, and the last book that I actually just finished last night was Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. I read this book in Spanish, and Juan Rulfo was a Mexican author. This book was originally published in 1955 and is now considered like a Mexican classic, one of the all-time great books of Mexican literature. And Juan Rulfo, through this novel, was kind of credited as the father of magical realism, which now is very associated with Latin America, for good or for bad. I think there are positives and negatives with like that one-to-one association with Latin America and magical realism. I read a really interesting book that delves into this, a nonfiction book called Magical Realism, earlier this year, which I thought a lot about while reading this book, knowing what I know about Juan Rulfo basically birthing like this magical realism movement. So I really recommend Magical Realism, the nonfiction book. But anyway, yeah, this was kind of the first book that is widely known for its speculative nature without being like a full-blown fantasy novel. Gabriel Garcia Marquez has talked about how he was very inspired by Pedro Paramo and Juan Rulfo when he began writing, and he's used Pedro Paramo kind of like as a north star when writing a lot of his books, like 100 Years of Solitude. And when I told my parents that I was interested in reading this book, they were familiar with it, and my mom said that she had to read it for school, so I think it's part of like a lot of Mexican schools' curriculum at this point, so that's just how important this is to Mexican literature. And I went into it kind of not knowing anything, and it's kind of a hard novel to explain in the first place, so I'm not surprised that I didn't really know anything going into it, even though I've heard about it so much. But in this story, we are following a man who goes into the town of Comala, which is a town in Mexico. I think it's in Colima. I think it's a real town. But in this novel, he goes to Comala to look for his father, who is Pedro Paramo. He was sent there by his mother. His mother just passed away, and before she died, she told him, I want you to go to Comala, look for your father, and demand that he gives you what he owes you. So as this man is making his way to this town, we're learning a little bit about him, and we learn that his mother left the town of Comala pretty soon after he was born, so he's never really known or had a relationship with his father, Pedro Paramo. And as we're making our way to the town, we start meeting people along the way, and we start learning some things about the town. And we realize that this town is filled with voices, but there are actually no people around. A lot of people have left, a lot of people have died. It's pretty much a ghost town. The narrative is very fragmented. It's not straightforward at all. We are jumping back and forth between now and the past in a very like illogical manner. We meet so many different characters. I was having a hard time keeping track of them all, but it's a very interesting story. It's mostly a story about this town. Pedro Paramo was like a really big and important person and powerful person in this town. He was very rich and he employed a lot of people, but he also did a lot of people dirty, and he owed a lot of people, and he betrayed a lot of people. He killed a lot of people, and he was basically solely responsible for the decay and the downfall of the town. So we just learned throughout these little fragments and through these stories and through these murmurs of the people that used to inhabit this town what happened. And yeah, it was really interesting. It was sometimes hard to follow, but it was still really good. And yeah, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. Like I said, I finished it last night, and I've since then been like looking for some guides and resources to help me like really understand the context of this book. For the most part, we're just exploring like patriarchal Mexico during the revolution. We're exploring how man's greed can corrupt, and we're exploring the way women were treated during this time. And there is like some historical context in the background of this story, which I'm not like super familiar with, but yeah, for the most part, it's just like a very haunting and interesting story, and I'm glad to have read it, especially knowing that this was the first, basically, the birth of magical realism, which is, as much as it's kind of a contentious genre, and I do think that it gets like thrown out too much, specifically for Latin American books and media, and is sometimes used to diminish the impact of a story. I do really enjoy the genre as a whole. Myself, I'm a big fan of speculative fiction, and I do love like some high fantasy, but I also love a magical realism story. I love like a normal story that takes place in the present or the past with like all the context of our actual history with just like some magical elements thrown in. And especially after reading magical realism, which talks about the differences between magical realism and fantasy, and how magical realism is really influenced by our collective history of oppression as Indigenous people, as Latin American people, as victims of empires throughout time. Getting to dive into that canon was really, really special. And yeah, just reading some of the Mexican classics is something that I've been wanting to do. So I've read Pedro Paramo now. I get it. Well, I'm still trying to understand, to be honest, but I'm very interested to dive even deeper and deepen my understanding of it. But yeah, that was a very interesting one. And that wraps up this video. Oh my gosh, that felt long. I have been putting this video off just because I was like, my memory is a little hazy on the past few books that I've read, but I'm glad that I finally did it, and I'm happy to be recapping books again. Let me know what you've been reading. Hopefully you're having a nice and cozy fall. I know I am. It's my favorite season, and I've been loving the cozy and spooky. I love the mix of those two vibes in everything that I've been consuming these past couple weeks. So let me know if you have any recommendations that fit that vibe. And yeah, that's it for today. Hope to see y'all around. Take care of me. See you next time.